Coming up, host of the podcast Coffee and Quack, Alice Glenn, joins the show to share how she explores contemporary Native life in urban Alaska. Plus, we visit with the creatives from Molly of Denali, who are teaching children about the life of Alaska Natives. I'm Malia Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from Indian country today.
The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is a proud supporter of Indian Country Today. Students at Cronkite News and Gaylord College at the University of Oklahoma cover Indigenous communities together. This important work is distributed by more than 100 news organizations. This collaboration provides a much-needed boost to coverage of Native American communities nationwide. Learn more at cronkitenews.azpbs.org.
This is Indian Country Today.
Amarawa Hopa. Thank you for joining us. I'm Malia Chavez. A federal investigation is being launched after Nooksack citizens in Washington state are under threat of being removed from their homes. Tribal citizens who live in 22 HUD households are set to be evicted over the holidays, even though several households fall under HUD-funded lease-to-own arrangements. While local officials are pushing the evictions with aid from police, the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development are both requesting a pause. These targeted removals are continuing despite the pandemic, holidays, and even flooding in the local county. Brian Newland, Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs, says his agency has also begun an investigation. Indigenous researchers are aiming to document the feelings and challenges of Native people living today. The Indigenous Futures Survey is a multi-year research project that asks participants a series of questions in an online anonymous survey. Ultimately, the researchers hope to use the survey answers to tell stories of systemic challenges in Native communities and to shape policy that could solve these issues. The project is being led by Illuminative, the Native Organizers Alliance, and Research for Indigenous Social Action and Equity. The survey is estimated to take 15 to 20 minutes and can be found at indigenousfutures.org. In Pennsylvania, 15 historical items are being returned after being taken for almost a century. According to federal authorities, the items were stolen in the 1960s and 70s, then were rediscovered in a sale of a rare 1775 rifle. The FBI art crime team also found other items, including a silver concho belt. The Philadelphia Inquirer is reporting that collector Thomas Gavin said he had taken the artifacts and kept them in a barn for decades. Because of the statute of limitations, he couldn't be charged in any of the thefts, the newspaper reported. Gavin, who is 78, pled guilty to one count of disposal of an object of cultural heritage stolen from a museum. He was sentenced to just 1 day in jail and 1 year of house arrest. Gavin is also ordered to pay over $23,000 in damages and a $25,000 fine. A new food documentary is highlighting 3 Indigenous women in Arizona. Indigenous food sovereignty is a movement that calls for healthy and culturally appropriate foods to be integrated into our diet. This includes making decisions about the amount and quality of food that Native people hunt, fish, gather, grow, and eat. And as the pandemic continues, concerns regarding food security have been heightened, while restrictions have placed increased pressure on food supply chains. The short film 3 Sisters shares how the women have reconnected with ancestral foods. The film also shows how Indigenous food sovereignty not only benefits health, but helps the women reclaim their culture. The documentary is available to view free of charge on YouTube. A story of joy. Indigenous Santa made a stop on his sleigh before delivering his presents this year. Over the weekend, he stopped at the First Americans Museum in Oklahoma City. The museum said they wanted to provide an opportunity for guests to see a version of Santa that they could relate to. Then, Indigenous Santa even sang a song for the children. The free event had over 160 children present. And those are the headlines for Indian Country Today. I'm Molly Chavez. Coming up, Molly of Denali is teaching children about the life of Alaska Natives. Plus, it's a podcast for Indigenous people by Indigenous people to help provide an accurate representation of Alaska Native life in urban and rural settings. We're visiting with the host. Stay tuned. When the PBS KIDS series, Molly of Denali, first aired in 2019, it opened up the world of Alaska Natives to children everywhere. Through the eyes of 10-year-old Molly, viewers learned about life in Alaska and, most importantly, about the life of Alaska Natives. Princess Johnson was the creative producer and helped launch this series. Today, Yetibe Evans is the creative producer on the show, and they join us both today to talk about the evolution of the series. Hi, Princess.
Hi, nice to see you.
And welcome, Yetibe.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good, thank you for asking. Princess, I want to start with you. Tell us about the creative process behind all of the episodes on the first season.
So initially when we set out to do this series, we knew that this was something that we really hadn't seen or done before. And so we wanted to really aim for making each story as authentic as possible. And so much of the first season was really learning the process of animation, which goes very quickly, and doing our best to keep up with that freight train of production, making sure that our stories started with our Alaska Native Advisory Group and the Alaska Native writers that we had at that time, which weren't many. It was myself and Vera Starbird. And we really set out to recognize that and build our capacity as Alaska Native people, whether that be through production, through voiceover, through the writing process. So we had to create those opportunities and really build our capacity to get to the place where we are today.
You know, one of the first episodes that stood out to me personally was Grandfather's Drum. And I want to talk about how you thought about approaching topics that can sometimes feel really heavy, but in a way, presenting them in a way that children can understand and empathize with.
It was really critical that we tell history and tell our stories from our unique perspective, because so many of the important Alaska Native people in our history, advocates and those that have really fought for our sovereignty, fought for our hunting and fishing rights, et cetera, are not highlighted in our schools and the history books. And so we had this opportunity, in particular with Grandpa's Drum, to tell this story that so many Americans did not realize had happened, which is this atrocity of having generations of our children stolen. And our Alaska Native elders, two elder advisors at those first production meetings, Luke Titus and Adeline Raboff, both of them shared these stories of our true history. And we knew that we could do it in a way from a child's perspective that would be healing and meaningful. And we need to heal from those histories that's continuing to happen. And we need to tell our own stories so that we can create the new. And this is really me quoting our elder Luke Titus. And so I remember how special and amazing it was that very, very first voiceover record when we had our actors and we had everyone together in the recording studio. We knew that we were creating something that was really special to each one of us, because that history damaging history of eradication of our culture, that genocide and colonization affects every single one of us as Indigenous people. So we just knew, we just knew it was a special, special story, and so grateful that it resonated and has gotten out to such a wide audience, and of course become an incredible teaching resource for not only young children, but all ages.
Grandpa's Drum was the very first episode that I saw of Molly of Denali, and all hearing you say all of those things, you're right. It really does stand out as something that I'll never forget watching that episode for the first time. Yeti Bey, I want to turn to you and ask what the very first episode that you saw, and what were your thoughts when you watched Molly of Denali for the first time?
Grandpa's Drum was actually the very first episode that I saw, and tears just came flowing to my eyes. And it's just such a powerful story because my own family has also gone through the boarding school experience. And by being able to tell the history, more people around the world get to know what we've endured and what we've triumphed through.
Sure. I want to ask you a follow-up question, Yeti Bey, which is how your childhood experiences sort of play into the work that you do. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. So growing up here in Alaska can be quite challenging through racism and stereotypes that are still prevalent throughout our society. And I experienced quite a bit of racism as a child, and wanted to set out to make a difference for our young people early on and really share that we are incredible, talented, resilient, loving, kind people, and we have a lot to give to this world. And so I went into the field of education and helped to teach a lot of other educators about our history and how to relate to families through cross-cultural communication. And now it has come, I believe, full circle through Molly of Denali and the experiences that we're able to share through the shows.
And Princess, I understand that you have a similar shared experience about your childhood and how it influences the show.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel like as a child, I felt invisible on my own homelands. I just didn't see people that looked like me reflected in any sort of media. And like similar to Yeti Bay, just encountered a lot of really harmful stereotypes and things that were projected towards me as a child that was really damaging for my self-esteem. And that really is such a critical part of why Molly of Denali has made such a big impact and is so critical right now, because we get to highlight those stories. And like I said before, from a child's perspective. And I think what's one of the things I also really love about this series is that we really highlight and utilize our Alaska Native values. So those really are illuminated through the series. And we are stronger together as a community. It's not about the individual. And so these stories where Molly falls down because we all make mistakes, and then the community comes together to help lift her back up, I think are really critical and shows what it's like in our Indigenous communities.
I want to talk about this new season of Molly of Denali and talk about some of the stories that you just mentioned. One of them is about a prominent and prolific advocate for Alaska Native issues, Elizabeth Perodovich. Yeti Bey, can you tell us more about that episode?
Yeah, so in the first episode, Molly and Elizabeth, that aired in early November, we see Molly and Tui experience some stereotyping when some tourists come into town and expect a certain type of native to give them a tour of Kaya. And they didn't want to receive the tour from, Molly and Tui as they were dressed in our modern clothing. And Molly and Tui were very upset. And Grandpa Nat and Layla, part of their, family came in to share, like, this has been going on for a long time. And Elizabeth Peratrovich stood up for our rights in 1945 to say that racism wasn't okay, and helped to pass the first Anti-Discrimination Act that Governor Gruning signed for our state.
And let's take a look at that episode.
How do you think Native children feel when they see signs that read, "No natives allowed," and aren't allowed in the same school as white children? Today, you can tell the world how we are treated is wrong and pass this law to make discrimination in Alaska illegal.
After Elizabeth's powerful speech, the law passed. People couldn't keep Native people from entering a store or movie theater or anywhere else.
Elizabeth Peratrovich was amazing.
We only have a short time left, but I want to ask the both of you one last question, which is, for you, what is the most meaningful part about being on a project like this? I know that I've read some articles about, children who have approached you saying, "I love this show, it's my favorite show," but I want to ask you on a personal level, what makes your heart feel good inside?
I really appreciate being able to share our real authentic stories and lived experiences with the world, and helping to encourage young people all over that they are valued and appreciated and that they have a lot to contribute. And I'm grateful to be able to continue to change the world of media and the representation of Indigenous people.
I think what's most meaningful to me is hearing from parents of Indigenous children how all of a sudden, after watching Molly, they're more interested in their language, in their native language. They're more interested in wanting to wear their regalia and dance and practice our culture, and just this sense of being seen. And I will never forget, at our premiere, we had the drum group come up, and my boys are typically shy and they don't like to get up in front of people, but they bum rushed the stage with everybody else that was at the premiere, all these children, and they were dancing so hard. They had so much pride. And to me, that's what it's about, is that we have all these children that are just really celebrating who they are.
Well, Princess and Yeribe, thank you so much for the work you do and for being here.
Thank you.
Masito.
And we'll be right back. The Coffee and Quack podcast is the brainchild of Inupiaq citizen Alice Glenn. After moving back home to work for her village corporation and a fellowship with the Rasmussen Foundation, she started thinking more about her heritage, and her podcast grew from there. She's here today to tell us more about her work. Hi, Alice.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So tell us about your podcast for those people who've never heard of it before.
Yeah, Coffee and Quack. So Quack is the Inupiaq word for frozen or raw meat or fish. And it's also a verb to eat frozen or raw meat or fish. And it's a podcast to explore contemporary Native life in urban Alaska. Coffee to represent our contemporary or woke side, and Quack to represent examining our topics through an Alaska Native lens.
And what kinds of topics do you tackle on this podcast?
Oh, we've got a bunch. So far, at least, we have traditional Inuit tattoos. That was my very first podcast episode. LGBTQ in the Native community, decolonization, Alaska Native foods, social media, Native earring creators. We've got a bunch. I mean, there's just a lot. And then on the side of Coffee and Quack, I also host and produce a podcast called Resolve, which is about missing and murdered Indigenous women in Alaska specifically. And then also Alaska Natives on the Frontline, which is a special series of Coffee and Quack highlighting the adaptability and resilience of the Inupiat in the face of climate change.
So tell us how you went from getting a bachelor's degree in aerospace studies to becoming an award-winning podcaster. What did that journey look like for you personally?
Yeah. So like many of, my my classmates, we attempted to go out into the world and into college. I was fortunate enough to be able to finish outside. So I went to school in Arizona and then Florida for a bit. And I always knew that something was missing when I was away. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I obviously missed so many different things about home, but living and working so far away from home, like over 3,000 miles away from my hometown, it was just, it wasn't very fulfilling. So I know that I wanted to continue my education after I got my bachelor's degree, but I thought I needed to go home and work a bit, kind of save up some money. And, but once I got back home to Alaska, not even home to Utqiagvik, but home to Anchorage, my heart was full. I felt so much better to be around Alaska Native people. I was so happy to be able to attend, family functions that I wouldn't have to fly so far from school to home. And I was just noticing all of the buzz around being an Alaska Native person and being back home, but I just wasn't seeing all of that. I like to reference this Christmas party that my sister was having. She was holding a Christmas party and they were doing that gift exchange game. And it was just so funny to see all of her friends, Alaska Native friends, fighting over a pair of earrings. And I just thought it was so funny and so fitting to be back home where Native ladies are fighting over earrings. But I never saw that kind of funniness or that brilliance or that sense of home in any of the media that I was consuming, so either the radio or on TV or, just in everyday life. I felt like it was in small pockets around Anchorage. And so I thought, if we had a radio show, what would it sound like? Or if we had a podcast, which I didn't even really know what podcasts were at the time, but it was like, what if I could reimagine what it meant to listen to podcasts? What would I want to listen to? What would I be interested in learning more about? And also just feeling and seeing our people laughing, and having a good time. And then talking about difficult topics as well. And so that's kind of how Coffee and Quack came to be. I was listening to a bunch of different podcasts and just kind of settled on maybe I can just talk about a bunch of different things, tackle a bunch of different topics and have them be their own episode. So yeah, I think that it was a lack of Alaska Native representation in media that I was seeing. And then some of the things that I was seeing, like on the news or on TV or on the radio, it was kind of defining Alaska Native people through an outside lens, which what if we could create it ourselves and share it out? If I'm creating a show for my younger sister, what would I tell her or what would I tell other people?
And that's really the sense that you get listening to the podcast. I've listened to a few episodes myself, and hearing you talk about what's something that I would create for my little sister, that's almost how it makes you feel as a listener. You're listening to the conversations of you and your guests, and I'm almost thinking, I'm not Alaska Native, I'm from the Southwest, but it almost feels like if I was sitting and listening to my cousins talk about, what does a beauty standards look like, or, exactly what you said, what does decolonization look like in society today. And so it really gives, I think, listeners a heartfelt understanding of sort of the issues that you all are grappling with.
Thank you. Yeah, I pride myself on the trust. You know, this idea of reciprocity. I've been interviewed before, and it can feel scary. You know, it can feel a little bit intimidating to kind of have, I guess, the camera lens on you, or the mic up to your mouth. So I take a lot of time and care in preparation for many of my interviews. Before the pandemic hit, I was recording all of my podcast episodes out of my living room, around my kitchen table, and, with native foods around so that we can eat and, drink coffee, make ourselves at home. And so I think that, thank you for saying that, because I do take a lot of pride in creating a trusting relationship with each of my I don't even really like to call them my interviewees. They're all my friends. I have their phone numbers. I still text them all and ask them how they're doing. And I think that that's been really crucial and important for the success of Coffee and Quack.
Definitely. Well, Alice, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. Thank you for watching. For all the latest news and updates, visit us anytime at IndianCountryToday.com. I'm Malia Chavez.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.
This is Indian Country Today.